What is up, fellow sickos? I am Dan Favale coming at you with a very special and returning guest, Mr. Keith Smith of, I'm going to fuck this up again, Keith, Spot Track. Did we
No,
get
you
it
got
right?
it that time.
We got it this time. He also hosts the NBA Front Office Show with Trevor Lane. They talk about a lot of stuff over there, so go check them out. The links to Keith's stuff will be in the podcast and YouTube description, as always. Keith, how the heck are you doing?
I'm doing well, man. It's a great time in the basketball calendar. We got March Madness cranking up. NBA playoffs are only a few weeks away. That means that the off season is coming around, which is a big thing in my world. So all good, man. I'm super excited for all of it to come.
I'm going to ask you a lot about off-season things, but I want to ask you one sort of current events stuff. How do you, when we get into like sort of the post All-Star break where we see these breakouts or these trends, like I get hyped up about some of them, like a Quentin Grimes or a Zeke Naji, but how much value do you ascribe to performances in the NBA that are like kind of happening right now? Like, do you take it with a measure of skepticism?
A little bit. I make note of it. So a good example, Jake LaRavia. Last year, Memphis is in the middle of a lost season. They're done. They stink. But he put up a string of really good games in a row, like game after game after game was really solid. They put the ball in his hands a lot. And I just made a note of it to see, all right, when we get into next year and things are more normal and they're playing to win again, what does that look like? And then some of that did carry over. Like you could see he was playing with more confidence. He was a little bit more comfortable doing things off the dribble, attacking closeouts, stuff like that. So little things like that, I try to make a note of it. But yeah, if a guy is like scoring 30 points per game on 33% shooting, I'm a little like, all right. Somebody has to take all those shots for these bad teams, and he's the guy.
That you just gave Sixers fans a lot of hope then that maybe Quentin Grimes will carry over into what he's doing right now next season. So Keith and I will get to teams that we think are really going to define and shape the offseason, but I want to ask about a lot of the sort of the CBA fallout that we've seen over the past year or so first before we get there, which can in turn shape that discussion. I want to start here. When you saw like and you really dove into, and you were on the podcast talking about it, like the CBA, when it was first agreed upon, and even as the changes started to be implemented, what did you think were the primary intentions behind the way the CBA was structured? And do you think that those primary intentions have now played out or are accurately playing out the way that the league intended?
Yeah, I think there was two ends. The one that got all the attention was very high profile, was taking the very high spending teams and bringing them down, bringing them back more to the pack. So the Warriors, the Clippers, where the Nets were heading, that's what they wanted to do. But the other side that didn't get as talked about quite as much was to bring the teams that were down here and bring them up a little bit, and bring everybody closer to the middle, bring everybody more to the same. So everybody knows, right? You can't have these super duper expensive teams, or if you can, there's all these restrictions that's going to make life really hard on you. Phoenix Suns, for example.
Mm-hmm.
What people I think missed a little was before the new CBA, you had the Spurs and the Pacers going into the season with $30-40 million of cap space just sitting unused. And what the NBA really wanted to do was introduce more money being used. So it sounds crazy to say it, but the less you bring teams down, or the less you allow teams to spend, the more players they can actually pay, because they're not spending it all on five guys. They're able then to sign other guys and use exceptions and all of that. And you're getting, in range of, instead of 100 guys make all the money and 300 make, very little money, you now have maybe 50 make all the money, or eventually we'll get there. And then you're going to have even more guys making, a whole bunch of money. And that's where they wanted to go. They wanted to introduce spending for those teams that were content to sit under the cap. And I think largely it's played out okay. You had kind of the phase-in years, which the Celtics and Bucks and Suns used to beef up their rosters and add guys that they could no longer add if this was starting right now. So they're just in a spot where, all right, once those teams kind of play themselves out, and that'll come over the next, so many years, probably sooner for Phoenix than the other teams. But as that comes, then I think we're going to see a much more even playing field. Never be truly even, because not every ownership group has the same kind of spending power or ability or ability to go get the right people collecting talent. But I do think we're going to see things balance out a lot more.
There's always everyone talks about unintended consequences of not just new CBAs, but when there's new rule changes. So far, there's probably still developments to come. What do you view as the primary unintended consequence that's really bore out so far as a result of the new rules?
Yeah, I think a lot got made over no one's going to be able to make trades and all that stuff. And then we saw this wild blockbuster trade deadline with, tons of big name superstars moving around and all kinds of stuff. Teams will always find a way. One of my favorite movies is Jurassic Park. Life finds a way. NBA teams will find a way, right? So they will figure it out. With that, I think one thing that was definitely unintended was the amount of teams that sat on their non-taxpayer MLE to then use it as a traded player exception, because that's a new change. That's something that's newer, and you saw very few teams use that as a spending tool to sign players to contracts. Most of them sat on that exception and then used it as a trade exception during the course of the year, which that's not really what the league wanted. The league still wants those being spent, because if you think about it, right, if I have that $12 million exception and I trade for a $12 million player, there's no new money being introduced into the system there. That's just $12 million players being moved around into a $12 million exception. If I signed a player for $12 million and then traded a $12 million player for a $12 million player, at least I've introduced $12 million new dollars into the system. And that's one where I think that was just a little bit of a miss. And that's teams being conservative and saying, hey, we don't really like the guys who are available right now in July. So let's hold and see if something better comes our way for a better use of that later. So that's, I think, one of the more unintended things that happened.
Yeah, that was something you and I talked about last year as to how many teams would hold it to try to use it as a traded player exception. The one that I don't know that I saw coming, and this is just anecdotally, and it feels maybe you knew it was coming because it feels sort of obvious in retrospect. The number of deals that just need to be 3 or more teams now feels like it's through the roof, and that it's going to become the standard. Like, because these teams are going to need to figure out a way to make the money work. When you look at teams that either they can't take back more money than they receive, or they don't want to take back more money than they receive because of the being hard capped. Did you see that one coming, that we were going to have this influx of 3 and 4 and more team deals?
Yeah, not that I'm patting myself on the back or any stroke of genius here, but I kind of knew it was going to have to be that way, only because of the restrictions around if you take back more than 100%, you're hard capped at the first apron. If you are a second apron team and still over the second apron, you can't aggregate contracts going out. I knew, all right, we're going to need this to turn into being a multi-team trade to get money going, moving around the way it needs to. I was wondering how teams were going to pull it off, because you didn't have teams sitting on, $20-30 million in cap space. You had the Pistons sitting on about 14 or so. And that's about where we'll be. I think, that's, roughly 10% of the cap is what any team can carry in now to the season. Because if you're not over the luxury tax line by the time the season starts, or luxury tax line, the salary cap line, by the time the season starts, they're going to put a cap hold on your books, which brings you up to the 90% marker, which is the salary floor. And then what happens is you still have that wiggle room there, and that's 10% of the cap that you have that wiggle room to use in trades if you want to sit on cap space. But the bigger penalty is you don't share in the luxury tax check if you don't meet at least the salary floor. So everybody's, from now moving forward, everyone's going to meet the salary floor, because no team is going to say, yeah, we can forego $12 to $15 million for nothing at the end of the season. That's not going to be a thing. So that's, I think, where we get to be a little bit of a challenge with that.
I think this is an intended consequence, but I underestimated it, of how many teams would be actively either afraid or trying to avoid being in the second apron. And so I'm kind of wondering that, I know Matt Ishbia for the Suns has just said he's going to continue to spend whatever it takes, but they're just a bad example because they're bad. And so I look at a team like Boston that has the ability to be sustainably great. Do you think they'll be a good litmus test, especially because they're not barren completely of draft picks moving forward, for the stomach that these teams have to stay in the second aprons, where we're not just talking about your pick 7 years out being frozen, but potentially getting moved to the end of the first round, or are they not even a good case study because they have like the whole ownership change potentially imminent?
Yeah, if we take the ownership change out, because who knows what that will bring, right? You're always hopeful that'll bring somebody who says spend even more, right? Let's go
Right.
crazy. Because if you're a sports fan, the only time you should ever root for ownership as a sports fan is when they're writing massive checks for your team. Like other than that, like who cares? Like let the money go to the players and the coaches and the front office people who actually do the real work, instead of a billionaire for his toy and his hobby. So I always kind of say, right, the role of a sports owner is hire good people, get out of the way, and write really big checks. Like that's what you should do. With that said, if the Celtics, let's say ownership is just, let's say they're basically the same, right? Like it's same attitude towards spending and all that. I think what you'll see with them is, and I think that this will be the kind of approach for any other team that finds themselves in a similar position to Boston, will be as long as you're competing for the title. And by that, I mean you're at least in a competitive conference finals, we'll feel good about continuing to spend at the level we're at. I don't think you're going to see, like, let's say they go back to back. I don't think you're going to see them say, well, we're just too expensive. Time to trade Kristaps Porzingis or
Mhm.
move Jaylen Brown or whatever it is. Because one, you're going to have to take money back anyway. So I think it's as long as we're competitive and we're right there, it'll be very hard to break up those teams because fans just won't stand for it, especially in a very loud fan base like the Celtics have. But the minute there's slippage there, let's say they lose before the conference finals. Let's say the Cavs blow their doors off in the conference finals. Then I think you're going to see, all right, hey, we need to make some changes. One, because that's the natural inclination is we didn't succeed. So let's
Mhm.
make some changes. But two, it'll be we didn't succeed and we're wildly expensive. We need to do something different.
And that, so if anything, it feels like it might prompt teams to be more reactive to coming up short, like in the playoffs, where it's, I think if you went to the conference finals with the Celtics after winning the title, let's say you lose in 5 games, yeah, there might be a natural inclination in general to want to make changes. But if you weren't facing the second apron restrictions, maybe you'd be like, well, it's the conference finals. We just won a title. Let's give it another year. But it seems like there'll be more instances of sort of like, even with Minnesota, kind of the way they've like remade their
Sure.
roster, where it's if you fail, and by fail I mean not winning the title, teams will just be quicker to make wholesale reactions to that failure.
Yeah, I think we may see that for sure. I think there's going to be much shorter windows given. Like no, I don't want to continue to make everything about the Celtics. I mean, I will happily, but I'm not going to. But with them, that kind of core group got to bang their head against the wall for how many times, right? Before they finally broke through
Right.
and they were able to get through. I don't think you're going to necessarily see that. Like, say the Wolves make a nice run this year, and then next year they're in the conference finals again. Then it's an NBA finals. I don't think you're going to see them just let's keep plowing money into this group and get there. I think it'll be all right. We didn't break through. Time to retool. I don't think it'll be let's tear it all the way down. There'll certainly always be those situations that'll happen, but I think it'll be more of all right. This is not the right mix. Let's see where we go. Like the Cavs might be a really good example. They don't get through this year. I don't know that they come back exactly the same or mostly the same. I think you might see them say, "All right, let's make a couple changes. What worked? What didn't work? What should we look to move, change, switch out, and go in a slightly different direction?" Because that pressure is just going to be so much to be one. If we don't do it sooner rather than later, we may get stuck with this group a little bit, and then all of a sudden it is all right. Now we've turned what could have been a let's retool on the fly, then maybe we end up rebuilding into a all right, we're just kind of stuck around the fifth, sixth, seventh best team in the conference for years and years and years because we can't get out of this now because we just get kind of stuck in it.
I'm also interested to see if there's not there. These aren't necessarily. I guess the Houston's an up and coming team, but where you have Houston and OKC specifically, where it's you have players, multiple players on their rookie scales who can turn into max or near max players. And like we've seen Houston with Jalen Green and Şengün already. They're probably even more fascinating than OKC, just because Şengün and Jalen Green of all, you have Ahmed Thompson and Tari Eason, and then Jabari and Eason are extension eligible this summer. I'm curious if we see more players being moved well, maybe they're still on their rookie deals. If you have enough and you're worried about having, we call them the fun maxes or Brian Windhorst, the fun maxes or the fun extensions. But if you built your team through a rebuild and you have all these higher profile draft picks who might command a lot of money, we've yet to see it, of course. I'm wondering if that becomes an offshoot of the way that the CBA set up right now.
Yeah, I think it certainly could. I always say it sounds awesome to have 7, 8, 9, 10 extra draft picks in like a 5-year window or whatever it is until they all kind of hit, and then you got to pay everybody. And there's no team in the league that could do that. So that's where I think what you may see, good example with Houston, right? So let's say Houston has a nice little run here. They make a little noise in the playoffs, but not a real contender. I think what you see is, well, rather than pay both Jabari Smith and Tari Eason and have Thompson's extension looming, and we've got, to do something with Fred VanVleet and all that. I think what you'll see them do is, let's take 2 or 3 of those guys, consolidate them into, I'm going to use Kevin Durant as the example, even though a million people have gone there and Houston has said a million times over, no, like we're not doing that. But, okay, I'll believe
NBA teams never lie either, Keith.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're always very upfront in their negotiations, especially through the media. But I think but that type of move where it is, all right, we'll go get the guy who can maybe push us over the top, and then we can play a little more year to year with that guy going forward. I think those are the kind of things you're going to see teams do, over the next, let's call it probably 3-4 years until things kind of renormalize again. Because that's what happens with the new CBA is first few years are always, we're figuring it out. We're kind of learning how to live under this new world. We're figuring out how, all right, who's making mistakes that we can take advantage of under this new world? Where can we kind of pick off talent or pick off assets because they're stuck this way? And then what you see is everything starts to renormalize when we get into a spot where about 4 to 5 years into it. And then, of course, let's renegotiate it again and change all these rules all over again and have to relearn it. But those are kind of the windows we live in with this.
You can correct me if you disagree here, but I feel like we are in a golden age of minimally bad contracts in the league where just the combination of, cap growth outpacing raises, and then the deals are just because of the extensions being signed, a lot of times they're just shorter where it's okay. Like this player's under contract for 4 total years instead of 5. With that said, I feel like maybe the past 2 seasons specifically, and I don't know if this is maybe part of the renormalization where teams don't know what they're dealing with in the, let's call it the apron era. So that's why they're viewed this way. But like Zach LaVine and Jeremy Grant specifically are 2 contracts where, the Jeremy Grant one, no one celebrated in real time. They found it curious mostly because of Portland's direction. But the way that the view of that contract has aged, and then even the way that like Zach LaVine's contract has aged, and then what he was, I know it's the Bulls, but like what they ultimately got for him for a player who's still really good and for a contract that at this point, there's only 2 more guaranteed years left on it. It's not like it's the end of the world. Are we going to now pivot back into where it'll be easier to spot like quote unquote bad deals? Or do you think that this is just maybe a short-term byproduct of teams figuring out the aprons?
Yeah, I think we're in a spot where there are less bad ones. I used to write annually, I'd write up a list of the 10 worst contracts in the NBA. And this year we didn't do it because it was just by the end, it was going to be like, we'll put this one on there, but it's really not that bad. Let me now explain why it's really not that bad. And that's kind of at that point, it's like, what are we doing the list for? Are there some bad ones? Of course there are. There's always going to be a handful where it's like, oh no, what happened there? But Zach LaVine's a great example. I had said, and you know this from private chats and stuff we've had, I don't think Zach LaVine's a bad contract from the standpoint of that was mostly about health. If he was healthy, super productive, pretty efficient guy, pretty plug and play in that he can play with a lot of different players because he can play on ball, he can play off ball, he can do a lot of different things. So that's where it felt like we kind of in this rush to declare everything good or bad, we were like, no, that's horrible. What a horrendous contract. Yeah. If he had continued to have knee issues and foot issues and everything else he had going on, that was going to be a bad contract because you just weren't going to see him on the floor. But once he was proven this year of he's pretty much past all that stuff, yeah, it doesn't look that bad. Now, on the flip side, you have one like Bradley Beal, which is a max deal with a no trade. So I think what's happened is teams have gotten smarter. They've also gotten a little more conservative, and players have played into it in a sense of they don't have the patience to necessarily stay in a place long enough
Okay.
to earn a major, large, bad contract. Where now it is, I want to move somewhere else. Then if it's you move, sometimes that takes away the supermax. Like Luka didn't ask for a trade, but Luka can't. Even if Luka does turn out to be 500 pounds next year and can barely walk, like it's never going to be a supermax deal because he can't get one anymore. So I
Right.
think that's where his players have pushed for more movement and things like that. Barely anybody ever qualifies for a no trade clause. That's why they're so rare. And then you're going to see teams, I think, be extremely stingy with them anyway, because it's going to be, yeah, we can't have this turn into a Bradley Beal situation where he can kind of hold the whole organization hostage that way.
Do you think that we could see teams also start to I don't even I wouldn't call this a criticism. I think it's just the way the system works. Teams should squeeze their own free agents more when it doesn't seem like there's a market. And a restricted free agency is the example I keep going back to because I'm pretty sure the last offer sheet from a rival team was when the Jazz gave Paul Reed one in the summer of 2023. It's like we don't see these offers. Like teams don't want to tie up, I guess, money in players they're probably not going to get. And yet, despite what is a clear lack of market elsewhere, we see like the Obi Toppin contract, not one of the worst deals in the league, but like who was giving him 4 and 60
Sure.
or even Emmanuel quickly in Toronto, who I think is a really good player. Do you think that we're going to start to see teams like kind of squeeze there? Like when you're looking Quentin Grimes in Philly or maybe Cam Thomas in Brooklyn this year, or do you think there's always going to be that level of one, maybe teams view this as we always need tradable mid-end salary, which fine, but when you're going 4 and 5 years, like that's where I'm like, okay, then what are we doing here? Are there always going to be that element of teams just paying their own players even though they don't have a ton of leverage, or could you see teams trying to exert that leverage more moving forward?
Yeah, I think there's levels to it. I think, like you mentioned, the Fun Max idea, those are still going to happen because those are more about it's of course it's about the money. I don't want to pretend that these hundreds of millions of dollars contracts aren't about the money, but a lot of that is also about respect of I am a max guy. And I think teams are going to be more willing to say, yeah, you're a max guy at 25% or 30%. We can live with that. Fine.
Okay.
I think what we're going to see is it's going to be that continuous squeezing of, I don't want to say the middle class, but it's like that, like upper middle class, if you will, where it's going to be like the Obi Toppins of the world, where it'll be, yeah, 15 million for him's a bit rich. And I think what teams are going to do is the really smart teams are going to sit down with their players. They're going to have a conversation where, hey, if we give all of you 3 to 5 million more than what we probably should, we will not be able to go get player 7, player 8 on our roster because we're going to be so capped out. We up against the aprons. It's going to be a problem. I think what will also happen, which is unfortunate, is the really cheap ownership groups are going to use that same strategy, but then they never have the intention of getting player 7 and 8, right? It'll just be we just don't want to pay you, right? It's just going to be where we want to live right at the cap because everybody basically gets to the cap in the end. But we want to live right at the cap. We don't want to be very far over it. We're not going to come in under it. We want to be right there. And that's where I think you'll see some of that happen. But I do think teams are going to be more cautious with the longer term,
Mhm.
slightly bigger than they should be contracts. Where what I think will be really smart businesses, like I used Grant Williams as an example for this a couple years ago when he was a free agent with the Celtics. I would not have had a problem if they gave him like a 2-year deal where they gave him like even 18 million a year, because the idea would have been now that's 18 million of tradable salary that we're going to need because we don't have tradable salary elsewhere on the roster without touching a core rotation guy. So I think that's where you could see teams still play some of those games, but you're going to have to play them on very short-term contracts where you feel really good about, all right, we can still control this and move this guy versus the idea of, yeah, let's just give out 4-year, $20 million a year contracts to everybody just because it's, not really going to kill us. It's rare. Yeah, some of the max deals that turn sour kill you, but it's more when you are piled up on these mid-range ones. And it sounds good to have 3 or 4 of them for trade purposes until you actually have to trade them. And then it's like, well, nobody wants them.
Right.
Then that's where you get stuck.
Do you think that there could be, I know you mentioned like mostly it'll be the, for lack of a better phrasing, like the middle class type of players that you could see squeezes happening. And I don't think that actual max stars will necessarily be squeezed, but do you see a scenario in which we could see more situations play out where teams are making the call to move on from these guys maybe earlier than you would expect? Luka is like the mother of all anomalies, but the fact that the Mavericks were purportedly that concerned about paying him, it did open my eyes to that. And we also have kind of seen it with, James Harden just not having like a market available outside Philly, and he's making sub max now. And even Paul George, he found max money in Philly, but like LA not really willing to go to that level for him, where I think, a few years ago, like put Paul George, same age, same injury history in that market. No, like that's probably not as hard of a decision. Do you think that this like new CBA has influenced that at all? Or is this just like a product of teams? I guess the aging stars is one thing where it's like, we don't want to necessarily review them as reflexive max contract guys, but even regardless of where you land on, who initiated stuff with De'Aaron Fox in Sacramento, that at least felt more like Sacramento driven than it normally would have been. So like, could that be a potential just effect of how the CBA is set up right now?
Yeah, I think let's take Luka and put him way over here off screen because that's its own thing, right? Like that was,
and they didn't get like,
whatever, right?
Like if you're talking about paying AD, so like, yeah, that's a bad example too, where it's like they didn't necessarily get cheaper. So it was weird to see someone at his age, even if you were concerned about his stamina, you're worried about paying him money when, even if the bar for max contracts is going to be higher moving forward, Luka is like, if you're not going to pay Luka, like who's the NBA player you're okay paying?
100%. Yeah. So just if we sit that one all the way off to its own, whatever reasons they did that, I'm sure you've had that discussion 100 times like I have. There's nothing really more to be said there. Either you're on board and you're Nico Harrison or you're everyone else on the planet and you disagree. But anyway, I think what you're going to see, Paul George being a really good example. I think you're going to see teams really draw a line in the sand with older player. We're not going to auto max you anymore. That's not going to be a thing. Like we are going to really say if there's injury history or you're bumping into the over 38 rule, like by the end of your contract or whatever, we're not going to do it. Like we're going to be very firm and staunch with this. Will some guys get there? Of course they will. Like LeBron probably will be on a max, near max for the rest of his career if he wants to be. And I know he left some money on the table, but that was his decision. I think where it's going to be interesting to see is the next level guy who comes in, who is they're going into that 35% max. They're a borderline all-star. Maybe they make it, maybe they don't. Do teams hold firm there and say it's either not going to be the max or we'll either give you years or we'll give you dollars, but you're not getting both. I think Rudy Gobert was a little instructive with that, with the Timberwolves, where it was, we'll give you the years, but we're not going to give you all the money. Like you're going to have to take less money. And that's probably how it should work. Where I think there is a sense of, once a guy's past that 10 years of service, there's some guys, they're fine, right? Because they're 10 years of service and they're not even 30 years old yet. So it's like, they're 30, they're going to be fine for another 4 or 5 years. But it's when it's like turning into contract number 4 or contract number 5 for a guy, they don't all need to be 4 years, 5 years in length, in total with, years left plus extension or whatever. Like Damian Lillard, I think now, if this was coming around in today's world, I think the Bucks, the Trailblazers, whoever it was, had his rights at the time, would pause and say, do we really need to go full length
Mhm.
max on this? Or can we hold back a little bit? And again, I think part of that conversation is going to be, hey, when you're 36 years old, is it really that important to you to be making 70 million a year? Or would you rather have us use some of that money to help you try to win? Because it's going to be really hard to do both. And that's where I think that'll be the give and take will be with those kind of players.
I didn't include this in the outline I sent you, but what would be the pathway to free agency becoming cool again? Or does it really still not exist? I've seen some people say that because of the aprons, that will somehow bring back the appeal and mystique of free agency. But I'm just like, maybe we're just too far removed from like the halcyon days of free agency for me to envision it. But I don't see how the current setup necessarily invites, for certain players like Kobe White, the 140% extension rule is not enough. And OG
Sure.
Anunoby this past offseason. But what did he do? He re-signed with the team that he was on right away. So is there a path to like free agency becoming cool again?
There is. And I think all this stuff goes in cycles. I think what you'll see is with the continued cap growth, and if teams are a little more conservative, you'll see probably 26, maybe 27, definitely by 2028. You're going to see 7, 8 teams hit the summer with cap space. When that happens, that's when you'll see free agents will say, okay, I'll time it up to maybe be a free agent there. Because like last year was like, all right, am I going to Philly? Like, okay, like if I'm not Paul George and going to Philly, then what? Why do I need to? Why shouldn't I extend? This summer, it's the Nets, and the Nets are clearly in a rebuild. They're not going to pull off the KD Kyrie summer again. So I think a lot of guys are like, all right, yeah, like I'd rather extend. And that's where I think what you'll see is it's the Kobe Whites of the world. Those are the guys who are more likely to hit free agency because what'll happen is the max guys, the Jason Tatums, the Lucas, those guys, they're always going to take the max extension until somebody doesn't, which is then when I always say if you're a fan of that team, that's the time to throw up the red warning lights and everything else and probably trade the guy
Yeah.
because you're probably in a spot where they don't want to be there anymore because no one turns down that max extension. It just doesn't happen. So I think that's where you're going to see, some stuff like that where it'll be a little bit more of it'll come back around in cycles. And then I think what will also happen is you're going to see teams will probably get even more aggressive with the let's just call it what it is, the tampering part of it, where it is, a couple years out, it'll be, hey, we know this guy really wants to play here. How do we start lining things up? And where the cap is going, as if you start dropping contracts off, you're not talking creating 20, 30 million in space. Cap's going to be pushing 200 million pretty soon. So where the cap starts pushing that much, you're going to see contracts dropping off, and then it'll be, hey, we're no longer capped out. We have $150 million in cap space to go spend. Now, a max contract by that point will be $70 million, and that'll be a slightly different thing because you'll be in a spot where it'll be, all right, well, we can get 1 or 2 guys. And that's where one of the things we've done on Spot Track, all of our salary pages have percent of cap next to the salary number because we want people to think in those terms.
Right.
Because I say that, guys are going to be making $70 million on a max deal. And people are like, this is crazy. This is nuts. I'm like, same percent of the cap that it was, 10 years ago. It's just everything's grown. It's just as everything grows, it becomes a much bigger number. But that'll be where I think you will see kind of free agency come back into play.
I was wondering if it would almost have the opposite effect where teams have cap space. And if you have more of a blank slate, maybe it doesn't matter. But like Jaren Jackson Jr. is a potential example, maybe a bad example because he's probably going to make All NBA. But like, could we see an increase in renegotiate and extends to where you're giving players bumps you don't have to in exchange for like in those out years you're saving a few $1,000,000 or whatever, like sort of what we saw with Larry Marketing, where it's they gave him a bunch of money now, which seems like they were buying his silence basically for the tank, but they didn't have to give him like the actual max money that they were going to. I guess we just still too young. And again, Jaren Jackson Jr. would only be the second example of that happening recently.
Yeah, good example though. Miles Turner did kind
yeah.
of what you were saying when the Pacers a few years ago did the renegotiation and extension where they gave him a whole bunch of money in that first year. And then the next 2 years were really probably a little under market for what he is as a player. But that's because he got it almost as a quote unquote bonus in that first year. The problem is getting to those positions to have all that cap space to be able to do that. That can be a very challenging thing to be able to pull off. So I think teams will much prefer the standard extension. But yeah, I say this all the time. It sounds awesome when you get the guy on a contract where you're like, man, that's a really good number for him. Jaren Jackson Jr. You mentioned Kobe White earlier in the show. Really great contracts until it's time for the next one.
Right.
Then it is, we can't really extend them off this number. They're going to hit free agency. Then that's when you're really hoping, all right, well, let's hope the bird rights trump all. We can get him to free agency and all those things. But you just enter in a bit of unknown that you'd rather have as a controllable there versus a variable that you don't really know how it will go and if it'll go your way. But you'll see renegotiation and extension come up. It's funny, they kind of come in waves. We'll have like 4 or 5 of them. Then we won't have any for a number of years. Then we'll like 4 or 5. But again, that's cap space comes in waves as well, where it'll be we stayed capped out for about a 4 or 5 year window. Now we have some cap space. Let's do some stuff. This is kind of coincidentally where I think, and I don't know if this is on your list, so apologize if I'm stepping on it, but the draft is going to become even more important for teams because one, you get them on those rookie scale deals,
Right.
which are almost automatically team friendly. And if you can nail draft picks, it just gives you a 4-year window where it's like you're kind of playing almost with free money a little bit there. Like people know nothing is better than a rookie quarterback in the NFL because they make like nothing and it's the most important position on the field. Like San Antonio Spurs, they still have 2 more years of Wembanyama making a pittance compared to what he should be making.
Right.
And that just makes everything that much easier, but you have to take advantage when you have those guys.
The draft stuff for sure. And I was actually surprised. We did a rule change podcast where we responded to subscribers, proposed all these rule submissions. And I was actually surprised at how many people want to abolish the draft as part of that, because I understand, like, in theory, giving players freedom of choice. It's like, that would be cool and is important. And it's in like, yes, us in what we do have freedom of choice, of course. I just feel like it's different when you're talking about millions of dollars versus the every person. But like, where do you land on that? Like, I just feel like the draft is way too important to like giving even a relatively fair playing field, like for teams to build from the ground up, that I can't even, and first of all, it's its own industry now, right? Like the NBA draft, its coverage,
Sure.
the NBA pumps it up. I'm still surprised, like I said, how many people would be in favor of like making it like a free agency driven, like for rookies, because I feel like that'd be, from a competitive landscape, I feel like it would be a disaster.
Yeah, this is where I always kind of go back to the like idea of don't compare our real lives to the lives of professional sports and athletes, because people will say things like, oh, load management is so ridiculous. Can you imagine if I told my boss I just wasn't going to come in today and wasn't going to come to work? And I'm like, and my first real answer is somebody worked in corporate America for 20 plus years is usually, you never took a sick day just to hang out. Like, come on. Of course you did, right? We all do. That was you. You were
I would
load
like my
managing,
editors
right?
to know, if they're listening, I've never once done that in my entire life.
Well, I don't do that anymore, but I love what I do now. But like, it's like, come on now, like we've all done that. So this is where when they're like, could you imagine if we, went to, all right, college graduates happen, and now all the top engineering companies draft all the top engineers instead of just paying them, more than the next place. And I'm like, yeah, but the top engineering companies are trying to put each other out of business. NBA teams are trying to beat each other, but the Lakers need the Clippers. They need the Jazz, right? Otherwise, there's no league. And that's where I worry is you start doing stuff like getting rid of the draft. Well, everybody's just going to sign with New York and LA and one of those teams because why not? Like I can make a ton more in endorsements if I'm in one of those markets. Now I don't need to really worry about it. So of course I'm going to go there and take a whole bunch of money that way because it's still a salary cap league and I can't make, just free, money off of whatever, but I'll make it up off the court. And that's where then what happens to Orlando and Indiana and all those teams. Like, where do they go?
Is there anything that you think is flying under the radar about the new CBA climate, or that you wish that when you're going on these shows, someone would ask you about that's not receiving enough attention?
Can I flip the question?
Yeah.
I really hope the trade deadline taught us like it's okay. Like, teams are really smart. They're going to find ways to make moves. I'm still hearing people be like, well, there's not going to be really a whole lot that happens this summer. It's like, you just saw like a whole crap load of stuff happen. And I go back to, I had the real pleasure to be a judge at Arizona State University Law School. Does a mock trade deadline competition where they bring in all these law students and they have to follow the real trade rules and all that stuff. In a 6-hour window, they made like 43 trades involving all 30 teams. Some of them, none of them were like crazy. Like, let me tell you this, there wasn't a Luka trade in there. So like, truth is always stranger than fiction. But like, I was like, yeah, if a bunch of college kids who are doing this kind of for fun, but also to build a resume and show off for NBA people, because there was a ton of NBA executives there. Like, if they could pull it off, NBA teams can pull it off. So that's where I'll flip the question and say something I would like to hear less of is like, oh, it's so restrictive and no one can do anything. We saw all kinds of crazy stuff happen. We're going to see it again this summer. Teams just have to get really creative, and it's going to be more 3 and 4 multi-team trades and all kinds of stuff. The Nets, I mean, Sean Marks, if he doesn't want to play the restricted free agent offer sheet game, he's got to be licking his chops saying, hey, got $50 million in cap space, like third team in, like who needs help, who needs me to eat a deal, right? Because that's where he should be, and he should be collecting, a ton of assets for doing that as it goes along. And then I would say one thing that is going maybe a little bit under the radar is I am curious to see where the frozen draft picks and draft picks being moved to the back of the round, how that's going to impact teams, especially if it is, we're close to going over the second apron and we could acquire player X who would really probably put us over the top to being a contender. But is that going to screw us several years from now? Where are we going to go with that? And that's where I think that's something that I think we need to pay a little bit more attention to, because that's one of the phased in rules that wasn't around for the first couple of years of the new CBA. That's now all coming into play now. So that's something I'm very much curious to see how that plays out.
Could that potentially have the effect of teams extending their window, because if they know that like they don't have that out down the line, that it's going to be so it's not even just frozen, they can't move it, it's going to be number 30, that we might as well we're going to pay, and if this team is still good, like we'll deal with that. And I guess the other thing is, I have not given this an iota of thought before you just mentioned that. Can you only have one draft pick like frozen and moved at a time? Like, is it cyclical where it's like if you're still in there, now your 2033 first round pick is also frozen, and that's in danger if you're in. So you could have multiple picks. Like, wow, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is that latter way. Yeah, and I'm just nodding like an idiot because that's really good radio. But yeah,
subscribers will appreciate it.
Yeah. So, but yeah, absolutely, that is where it is. Yeah, you could continue. It just rolls. 7 years out, 7 years out, 7 years out. It just keeps rolling over. And then there are mechanisms where if you get out from underneath, it becomes unfrozen and you can do things. Because the idea is who's probably really going to still be, if you're a second apron team in year 1, are you really probably going to be one in year 5? Probably not. And that's where I think they're hopeful that could be punitive enough to say, get yourself out of there so you can free that up and do things. But I think, to your point, I do think you are going to see teams where if you feel like, again, I'm going to make it about the Celtics, but if you feel like, hey, Tatum and Brown and almost whoever else we throw around them, we'll just keep rolling over the salary slots and the new guys. We keep this going. You may see them push that where it's like, all right, you know what? We're probably going to pick 28th anyway. Who cares if it's 30th? What difference does it make? We're not looking to trade that pick. So it doesn't matter anyway. So that's where I do think you will see a little bit of that come into play as well.
All right. Are you ready to get into some teams that will define the offseason, our little draft here?
I love it.
As the guest, you get to go first. Who's the first team you're looking at?
All right, I'm going to do the very easy one off the board, Phoenix Suns, because Kevin Durant's going to get traded. And whatever happens there, that's going to be seismic, right? It's
Yep.
KD. I realize it's this version of KD, but he's still KD. He's still awesome. That's going to set up a lot for the rest of the league.
Yeah, I mean, that's like there it's I'm trying to think that whole lead up to the trade deadline where they were shopping him without telling him, and then it just you knew it was real when Brian Windhorst comes out in advance of something rather than after the fact and says,
Yeah.
"Yeah, he's gone." And I'm just like, I was like, we've gotten to a point where like it's so fait accompli that it feels awkward. Where like you could always forecast when KD might be traded or leave, but the fact that it's just a foregone conclusion, it's giving like that final year of the Warriors vibes, but even more inevitable. I'm so curious to see what he fetches. As just like we've seen their reported asking price, but just given his age, only a year left on his contract, which I don't think matters too much because if you're getting him, you probably have insight whether he wants to stay.
Yeah.
But do you think that people will be surprised at how much he gets or surprised at how little he gets? Like which sort of end of the spectrum do you skew
I
towards?
think it's probably going to be the second one. I don't think they're going to return a massive value for him because I think what's going to happen is the Suns are just did not take whatever you can get for him, but I think it's going to be we cannot run this back. This is not good for anybody involved, and it's going to be let's just move on so we can do whatever else we're going to do moving forward. And I think it is going to be a little bit less than what people really think.
Do you have like a favorite dark horse team for him? Like if we know all like kind of the usual suspects there, but do you have like a team that's not really mentioned or only tangentially mentioned that would be interesting to see him land on?
Yeah, I would love to see like what if San Antonio jumped in? I was like, let's go. Like we're getting Wemby back. We've got De'Aaron Fox now. We could get KD. Why can't we be a top 4 team in the conference and just push in and try to make something happen like that? That would be one. Bring him back to Texas where he went to school, right? And just kind of bring him back there. I always wonder what it would be like if Washington said, "All right, it's time." He's only got so many years left. And I think if you're the Wizards, you almost look at it as let's do it because we're probably getting off one of the contracts we don't really want anyway, like Middleton or Smart or something in that trade. And if it doesn't work out, fine. We'll either retrade them ourselves. Guess what? We're bad. We'll still be bad. Or it'll work out great and we'll be, back to being the, playing Wizards again. And, but at least with some young guys around them. I always kind of wonder about that.
The Spurs are fun, and they're one of the teams. Like another one would be maybe the Pelicans, just because they have Zion. Where it's no, they wouldn't do it. But if you end up winning the draft lottery, and then so we have Cooper Flag talent that can win immediately, and so we're going to go out and get KD. Would be like a fun scenario to see something like that happen.
Yeah, that would be a blast. I wouldn't mind that.
I would like Memphis for him. Their salary matching gets weird if you don't want to give up Desmond Bane. Like it probably becomes impossible at that point. But seeing him play next to Jaren Jackson Jr. would be loads of fun. And we've wanted them to have, I know they have Jalen Wells and Vince Williams, but we've wanted them to have like a premier wing for since Rudy Gay, basically.
Oh, easily. Point. Yeah, for sure. Somebody who can hit shots too, right?
My team is another obvious team, but I made a note. It's the Brooklyn Nets, but I made a note of this when they were going through when they acted early on the trade market because they were too good and traded Dennis Schroeder. But I made note in the back of my head that they didn't take back any long-term money in that deal. Then they went around and did the same thing with Dorian Finney-Smith. And so cap space can be used for a bunch of different things. And I would be pretty surprised if they went and tried to spend it on free agents. But I also looked at it and said, it feels like they are actively prioritizing that cap space now. And so it makes it as a third party team, or I don't know where they land in the lottery, but are they going to want to make, like, if there's a star that they just think is young enough to go after, they're a team that just as a facilitator in these bigger moves, or maybe being able to make bigger moves in free agency or on the trade market of their own. I found it fascinating that they prioritized cap space to the extent that they did while they were making midseason trades.
Yeah, I think what they realized is the market to eat contracts at the trade deadline was not going to be that great to get great assets, but the market to eat contracts this summer to get assets is going to be huge. Like, for example, if Minnesota wants in on KD, they're going to have to trade Julius Randle. And sure, maybe the Suns could do something there. But because of the apron concerns from both teams, it's probably going to take a third team. If I'm the Nets, hey, hand up. We'll take Julius Randle's last year of his contract. Just send over, a pick with it, or send, one of your kids or something, that makes it worth our while to do so. And I think that's the kind of thing you're going to see them do. I am very curious to see too. Do they play it all in the restricted free agent market again? Jonathan Kuminga, Josh Giddey, like Sean Marks has done it. Now, if you don't get them, let's not turn around and trade for all of them a year later, like you did last time around with Tyler Johnson and Alan Crabb, and eventually, kind of funny. I think they did get Otto Porter Jr., but way down the line. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if it's there, because I think what you could do if you're the Nets is, hey, we go get one of those guys with our draft pick, with a couple of the younger players we have on the roster, a couple of the guys who are on a longer term deal. Why can't we be right back in the mix with Orlando and Atlanta at the bottom of the conference? Why can't we take a Pistons jump if we get the right guys? I'd rather see, let's be patient and build it out. But I am very curious to see how that goes.
Who would be your next team?
This one's going to sound a little strange, but it's more of a, what is the long-term play here? And it is the Oklahoma City Thunder. And why I say that is, one, if they fall short, do they start to make changes? Do you start to cash in some of the picks and some of the players and do some of the stuff where it is, let's go do something, right? Let's really try to beef up. But let's say things go well, they're in the conference finals or in the NBA finals, maybe they win the title, whatever. What do the extensions look like for Chet Holmgren and Jalen Williams? Are they just here's two max deals and off we go? And then knowing SGA is going to get a max deal coming up pretty soon too? Or is it going to be, let's try to, like we talked about basically the whole show, let's try to squeeze a little bit and not just hand out max deals. I'm very curious to see how they play this.
Yeah, I'm with Chet specifically. I just wonder will there be any injury protection baked in? Would he even accept that? They're a team that operates pretty conservatively. So I feel like one of those extensions might either come in less than the max or may just have certain, for Chet specifically, weird language in it. And I'm also wondering with them too, it feels like kind of a case of, well, how much do the playoffs define what they offer? Where if they get to the playoffs and they lose in the second round again and the offense struggles, even with Shea on the court, what does that mean for the value of Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren moving forward to them specifically?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I wonder. Do we get to a point where it becomes, let's look, we need to do something a little bit different, right? We need to add different kind of players or wherever it goes. So very, very curious. And we all know they've got still, countless draft picks to go that they could put in the trades if they want to get involved in all kinds of stuff.
If they end up with that Philly pick too at number 7, my God.
Right. Yeah.
My next team, it's a team I would never bet on, but it's also a team that I just can't quit. They have one of the highest net ratings against top 10 teams in the league, the Minnesota Timberwolves. So they don't have tradable picks, but they're about $13 million away from the second apron if Naz Reid and Julius Randle pick up their player options, and that's not including a new deal for Nickeil Alexander-Walker. I'm open to the idea that maybe Julius Randle's back at a lower number. I would not guess that Nickeil Alexander-Walker or Naz Reid are going to be back at lower numbers. And so I'm very curious to see what their stomach is for floating this core moving forward, which, again, that will be determined to some extent by the playoffs. The fact that they were linked to Kevin Durant, though, I have my eye on that. And then just in general, because it's Julius Randle could maybe be this big, he's another player where I don't know who's paying Julius Randle. And if he went out and took the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, it takes him more than 2 full seasons to make up what he was going to make. So will they look at moving him? What is could they potentially move on from Naz Reid? It feels like their team is going to look materially different for better or worse. And I don't know what direction it's even if Julius Randle, it feels like if he opts in might be the cleanest scenario for them. But you still might have to pay Naz Reid. And if he opts out, is there a team coming in at more than $16 million a year, close to the non-taxpayer mid-level when there's finite cap space? Are we looking at sign and trades? Is he just leaving? A team like Detroit decides to create cap space, or he might be a good fit on the Nets. they have very little flexibility, and yet they're going to be so fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I think if you're Naz Reid, you're kind of hitting the midpoint of your career, or you like, I would like to start, and see, like, is that something he looks for along with, money and all that stuff. But yeah, I'm with you for all the same reasons you laid out. It's going to be a fascinating summer for the Timberwolves, just because they're close, right? And you have
Right.
Anthony Edwards, and the last thing you want to do is, man, we have Ant while he's still young and pre-prime. Like, let's really try to get after this. And really, that's how you extend these windows. And instead of it being a 4-year window, it turns into an 8-year window because we put the right guys around them. So, yeah, I'm with you in the KD stuff. As a cap nerd, endlessly fascinating because how the heck are we pulling this off?
No
Right? Like,
picks,
you're
right?
talking,
Yeah.
yeah, right. 2-second apron teams. Like, what's this going to look like? How do we get there? And that's, again, they'll get there if they really want to, but how, that's going to be really fun to track.
I've also wondered, I don't know what his market would be, but if you want to keep Naz Reid and you think that he can be kind of your starting big, and maybe you believe in being able to approximate backups, you have Leonard Miller there. They seem pretty high on
Sure.
him. Could Rudy Gobert just be traded? And he would look, if the Suns are looking to be competitive post KD, like, he would probably make some sense in whatever permutation they work up. But I don't know what that permutation looks like, Keith, because it's okay. So it's Rudy Gobert and Julius Randle, and you're bringing in other teams. Like, are the Suns going to accept that? And if you're the Wolves, would you give up Rudy and J-Mac? Like, in that type of a deal? It's just, I don't know how big of a threat they really are for KD, but if they ended up with him, I would kill to know what that deal looks like in advance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's even when they said it was starting, we talked about. I tried and couldn't get any real clear answers. Like, how deep into this did you get with these conversations? Because, like, it's just so complicated. Like, that's gonna be a lot of fun to track if it happens.
I have a bonus question on the Timberwolves because it wasn't clear based on the reporting. I'm curious if you know any more. Did they understand when the Mavericks came calling for Anthony Edwards that Luka Doncic was on the table, or was that kept a secret?
I have no idea. Like, I half the Lucas stuff, I'm like, really? Like, you were just randomly calling on all these other team stars, and they were like, because my answer would have been, sure, you trading us Luka? Like that. That's how they said, could we trade for Anthony Edwards? My response would have been, sure, trade us Luka. And is
Right.
that what they were looking for? And then it was like, okay. Like, then wait, what? Like, really? Like, I don't know. It's so weird.
But what's weird too is that if that happened, though, how did it not really get out until it happened? Unless it was like the night of that they had this discussion with Minnesota. So I just found that reporting fascinating.
Yeah.
Who would be your next team?
All right, I'll say Utah.
Ooh.
Only because, one, obviously the league was like, knock it off. Like, no more of this sitting everybody's stuff. There is the marketing stuff out there of, like you said, they kind of paid for silence, but there was an understanding of, this is not going to be like a 4-year thing. This is going to be only a couple years. They've got all kinds of draft picks coming up, a lot of flexibility with their cap. Where do they go? That's the team I've got an eye on.
Yeah, there, and then it's also just like, is Larry Markkinen available, and is he an asset even after the season that he's having? And they're another team where it's sort of like, it feels, and they've been in their rebuild. This is year 3, and they don't really have like a blue chip cornerstone to show for it. So that's the importance of this draft baking in. But is there any like angst around the organization to, hey, like, we actually need to take like more of an immediate win-loss step forward rather than kind of tearing it down even further? Because they were too, I know people criticize them for this, but we all had them like in the doldrums immediately after they traded Gobert and Mitchell. This was just 2 consecutive years of being better than I think internally and externally they were ever expected to be. And it's oddly almost set them back.
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? And that's where, like, I get when Raptors fans and Nets fans are like, we're winning too many games. Like, as much as it feels bad to root for losses, the way the NBA is set up, I mean, really almost any of our professional sports, really it's the NBA and NFL are the 2 big ones with the draft. You root for losses because the wins will come if you do the right thing in the draft. And that's where it just gets really tricky. But yeah, I think Utah, I also I don't know that Danny Ainge is in this for like a 5-year rebuild. Like, something tells me he, didn't sign on there to do this until he's 90. So I think there is a chance like he's going to be like, let's push a little bit more and try to be better a little sooner rather than later.
They would be really, because I love when random teams come out of the woodwork where it's the next player who's like in their 20s, that's a star, becomes available, and the Jazz are like, you know what? We're going to take our top 5 pick, and we're going to try to rebuild around them. And like if it's a Devin Booker type deal, they were like, no, we're going to go and get Devin Booker, even though maybe we're not on his preferred list.
Yeah, I always tell people with Utah too, it becomes this whole it's not a free agent destination and players don't want to play there and all this stuff until they play there. And then every single guy you talk to will tell you, I loved it in Utah because one is when they're home, they just want to be left alone and like no one bothers them there. And then when they want to go out, it's like a 30-minute trip to Las Vegas, like via the air. So like guys are like, I can pop over to Vegas if we have 2 consecutive days off, party one night, come home the next night and be ready to get back to work. Like I've talked to so many players that are like, I didn't really want to go there at first, but once I got there, I loved it. And that's where I think they kind of know, hey, we can get guys. And once we get them here, they're happy to be here. Like they're not, so like, oh man, I'm just stuck inside all the time. There's nothing to do. So that's something I always kind of keep in my back pocket of, if they make any kind of surprising move, it's like, yeah, well, they probably feel pretty good about they're going to win the guy over.
My next team is the Houston Rockets. I think everyone has them ticketed for a consolidation trade, and I would agree, but I don't know if it's coming this offseason. Again, it's a case of the playoffs will determine a lot. I don't believe in their half-court offense. It's bottom 5 in the league, very dependent on Fred VanVleet. I think they need somebody who's more consistent than Jalen Green and a better playmaker than both VanVleet and Jalen Green in there on the to work from the outside in specifically. But I don't like when you look at what they've accomplished this season, contending for a number 2 spot in the West. If you win a playoff series or take a good team like the Warriors to 7 games or something, and you don't have to, okay, Şengün and Jalen Green, their deals are going to kick in. Eason and Jabari Smith Jr. are just extension eligibilities. You could let it ride out to RFA. You could extend them and then figure it out next summer. I think that, and especially I believe the answer to everything they need is actually on the roster. That's how high I am on Reed Shepherd still. I'm interested to see whether they take that slant, depending on what happens in the postseason. And if they do, if you're a team that ends up being a seller, that's removing like a pretty big potential suitor from the equation. And then I would be curious to see how that impacts the overarching trade market.
I think this is where it's really, really hard to be an NBA GM because the Rockets are a perfect example of if you go too early, maybe you never get there. And if you go too late, maybe you never get there. Meaning, like if you cash in right now, then your younger guys that you need to, like the ones who are still left, that you need to be really good, aren't quite ready. If you wait a little too long, then what ends up happening is you never get there. Right now, all of a sudden it's, man, we had all these nice young players, but they're not really all that interesting as trade chips, right? It's people ask me all the time, like, why do teams want draft picks so bad? Because the draft pick can be anything, right? It can be, it could be the next all-star. Once a guy is kind of on the floor and you've kind of seen him, you're a little like, all right, he's okay, but he's not really there. And that's where I think what's really interesting with the Rockets is, do you get there, or do you just keep pushing with the guys you have? Because I'm with you. I love the young core. I love the way they've put this team together. But if they don't all come together perfectly, you're never going to actually take that next step. And then that may be where now we kind of missed our trade window.
And there's like the element of after this season, there's just going to be expectations caked in. If you finish 3rd or whatever in the West, that's the bar, fair or not. We know progress isn't linear, but that's the bar to which you're going to be held, not just moving forward, but for next season specifically.
Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah. If you're not like this year, I think everybody kind of, you're kind of almost playing with house money right now, a little bit, where it's like, just get into the playoffs. Don't embarrass yourself. Even if you lose in the first round, as long as it's competitive, I think everybody will live with it. But next year, it has to be better, right? You can't keep running that same thing back, and that's where we've seen teams sometimes they run into it, and then it's like it never actually gets better. And then it's like, man, we kind of missed our window because now it's guys are on that second contract or they're the shines off them as prospects or whatever it may be. But yeah, I'm with you on Houston. I love that young core. I'm okay if they want to grow it together a little bit more, maybe make a tweak around the edges a little bit here, but I'm all right if they don't want to cash in for like Kevin Durant or whoever it is right now, because I don't know that that's gonna be better for them 2, 3, 4 years from
Yeah.
now.
I actively advocate against the Kevin Durant fit unless he's just so cheap that it's like money and
Sure.
a pick or two. Is there anything about the Fred VanVleet team option that will signal maybe that, like, if they pick up the Fred VanVleet team option, does that seem to make it more likely that be making a bigger move? Because in my head it was, why wouldn't you decline it and try and bring him back at like a lower number if you actually wanted to keep him around?
Yeah, I think if you just pick it up, I think there's a better chance that by the trade deadline, you're thinking we may want to put him into a deal, and really do something big. If you don't pick it up, then I think you're in a spot where it becomes, all right, let's try to take that $45 million he's owed, and let's break that up into 3 years, 60 million or something like that. Where it just rebalances a little bit better moving forward. So yeah, that'll give us a little bit of a signal on which direction they're headed.
Did you have any other teams left on your list to watch?
No, you hit the big ones, and the ones I gave you, those are the teams I'm kind of keeping my eye on.
I will say I do have one more if you have the time for it.
Yeah,
The Portland Trailblazers, I've seen a lot of their fans being disappointed that like their draft pick's not going to be higher, and I sympathize and I would normally agree if they weren't like finding success with the players who should be playing for the most part. And I'm very curious to see how, if at all, they react to their midseason success over the offseason, to where, okay, they're not going to have cap space, but you have a bunch of players, whether it's Jeremy Grant, Anthony Simon's going into a contract year, Ayton's expiring, Robert Williams III, that you could justify moving the veterans. But if you do move any of those guys, I don't know what the market for Grant is. Are you looking for draft picks and prospects in return? Or are you, because it feels like they're a team where their rebuild feels like it actually started earlier than it did because of how pointless the latter Damian Lillard years ultimately were? Are they going to be in a position to where it's over? They looked at the progress Scoot made, what Tamati Kamara is doing, Donovan Clingan, what he's been able to do this year, the moments from Shaden Sharp. Are they going to look, and having Denny Avdia, are they going to look at it and say, we're going to like try and like consolidate here, like ultimately try to get better rather than like continue this phase of our rebuild?
Yeah, I'm with you. They're like a sneaky team where I could see them take a couple of the veteran guys that aren't necessarily really big parts of the future and turn them into somebody who can really try to lift them next season. Because I think they've done the rebuild thing now for a few years. I think there's some level of impatience there of let's try to be better sooner rather than later. Let's not get caught because some of these teams in the West just they're not going away anytime soon. So we don't want to get caught where we're perpetually somewhere between 8th and 12th in the conference. So I do think you may see them try to push forward sooner rather than later.
I do also really quickly just have my eye on Milwaukee because Brook Lopez is a free agent. And if for some reason, I mean, like, what if they lose to, as of right now, they could lose to the Pacers in round one. And with Brook Lopez being a free agent and older, what does that do to like everyone talks about, well, Giannis has to drop. Like, if Damian Lillard doesn't make a deep playoff run with this team in his first 2 years, what happens with him? And then what kind of trickle down effect does that have for Giannis? They feel like sort of the wild card team of like, oh, they could really like dictate the biggest offseason sweepstakes this summer.
Yeah, I'm with you. There's certainly going to be, if they fall well short of their goals, which I think, it's going to have to be a conference finals run for them to feel anything good about where they're at. I think you're going to see them definitely make some changes. And yeah, we'll see with Brook Lopez. I mean, he's still clearly getting it done, but Brook Lopez has always seemed like one of those guys who, when he's done, like he's just going to be, I'm done, and just walk away and hang out at Disney World and be happy doing that versus just I don't know that he's gonna play forever just to keep playing. Like it's never really felt that way with him, and that's not a criticism by any means because we've all seen guys who stuck around several years too long. I've just never gotten that sense that he's going to be that guy.
Keith, this was great. As always, you were super generous with your time. Your insight remains beyond compare. Are you able to just to tell our listeners and subs where they can find you and all the fantastic work that you're doing?
Yeah, you can find my written work over at spottrack.com as well as the basketball bulletin. Most days, I do NBA game notes, which is just notes from the games I watch, plays that stood out to me. I don't do a lot of commenting on like, oh, Luca had 50 last night because you probably saw that. It might be more like, Dorian Finney-Smith had 7 assists and did some on-ball playmaking. Like those are the kind of things that I try to highlight there and catch things that go a little bit under the radar. And then if you're interested in more off-season talk, transaction talk, roster type stuff, CBA things, NBA front office show with Trevor Lane and I, and find that anywhere you listen to podcasts or over on YouTube.
Thank you so much as always, Keith. Rest assured, I will be pestering you again in the future. And once more, thank you so much for your time, and I'll talk to you soon.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me.